The Ego and the ID 1923. The present discussions are a further development of some trains of thought which I opened up in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920g, and to which, as I remarked there, my attitude was one of a kind of benevolent curiosity. In the following pages, these thoughts are linked to various facts of analytic observation, and an attempt is made to arrive at new conclusions from this conjunction. In the present work, however, there are no fresh borrowings from biology, and on that account it stands closer to psychoanalysis than does Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It is more in the nature of a synthesis than of a speculation, and seems to have had an ambitious aim in view. I am conscious, however, that it does not go beyond the roughest outline, and with that limitation I am perfectly content. In these pages things are touched on which have not yet been the subject of psychoanalytic consideration, and it has not been possible to avoid trenching upon some theories which have been put forward by non-analysts or by former analysts on their retreat from analysis. I have elsewhere always been ready to acknowledge what I owe to other workers, but in this instance I feel burdened by no such debt of gratitude. If psychoanalysis has not hitherto shown its appreciation of certain things, this has never been because it overlooked their achievement or sought to deny their importance, but because it followed a particular path, which had not yet led so far. And finally, when it has reached them, things have a different look to it from what they have to others. The ego and the superego, ego ideal. If the ego were merely the part of the ID modified by the influence of the perceptual system, the representative in the mind of the real external world, we should have a simple state of things to deal with. But there is a further complication. The considerations that led us to assume the existence of a grade in the ego, a differentiation within the ego, which may be called the ego ideal or superego, have been stated elsewhere. Point superscript 1. They still hold good. Point superscript 2. The fact that this part of the ego is less firmly connected with consciousness is the novelty which calls for explanation. At this point we must widen our range a little. We succeeded in explaining the painful disorder of melancholia by supposing that an object which was lost has been set up again inside the ego, that is, that an object cathexis has been replaced by an identification. Point superscript 3. At that time, however, we did not appreciate the full significance of this process and did not know how common and how typical it is. Since then we have come to understand that this kind of substitution has a great share in determining the form taken by the ego, and that it makes an essential contribution towards building up what is called its character. Cf. on Narcissism, An Introduction, 1914c, and Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, 1921c. Superscript 2, except that I seem to have been mistaken in ascribing the function of reality testing to this superego, a point which needs correction. It would fit in perfectly with the relations of the ego to the world of perception if reality testing remained a task of the ego itself. Some earlier suggestions about a nucleus of the ego, never very definitely formulated, also require to be put right, since the system piece PT, CS alone can be regarded as the nucleus of the ego. At the very beginning, in the individual's primitive oral phase, object cathexis and identification are no doubt indistinguishable from each other. We can only suppose that later on object cathexes proceed from the ID, which feels erotic trends as needs. The ego, which to begin with is still feeble, becomes aware of the object cathexes and either acquiesces in them or tries to fend them off by the process of repression. Point superscript 1. When it happens that a person has to give up a sexual object, there quite often ensues an alteration of his ego which can only be described as a setting up of the object inside the ego, as it occurs in melancholia. The exact nature of this substitution is as yet unknown to us. It may be that by this introjection, which is a kind of regression to the mechanism of the oral phase, the ego makes it easier for the object to be given up or renders that process possible. It may be that this identification is the sole condition under which the ID can give up its objects. At any rate, the process, especially in the early phases of development, is a very frequent one, and it makes it possible to suppose that the character of the ego is a precipitate of abandoned object cathexes, and that it contains the history of those object choices. It must, of course, be admitted from the outset that there are varying degrees of capacity for resistance, which decide the extent to which a person's character fends off or accepts the influences of the history of his erotic object choices. In women who have had many experiences in love, there seems to be no difficulty in finding vestiges of their object cathexes in the traits of their character. We must also take into consideration cases of simultaneous object cathexis and identification cases, that is, in which the alteration in character occurs before the object has been given up. In such cases, the alteration in character has been able to survive the object relation and, in a certain sense, to conserve it. An interesting parallel to the replacement of object choice by identification is to be found in the belief of primitive peoples and in the prohibitions based upon it, that the attributes of animals which are incorporated as nourishment persist as part of the character of those who eat them. As is well known, this belief is one of the roots of cannibalism, and its effects have continued through the series of usages of the totem meal down to Holy Communion. The consequences ascribed by this belief to oral mastery of the object do in fact follow in the case of the later sexual object choice. From another point of view, it may be said that this transformation of an erotic object choice into an alteration of the ego is also a method by which the ego can obtain control over the ID and deepen its relations with it, at the cost, it is true, of acquiescing to a large extent in the ID's experiences. When the ego assumes the features of the object, it is forcing itself, so to speak, upon the ID as a love object and is trying to make good the ID's loss by saying, "Look, you can love me too. I am so like the object." The transformation of object libido into narcissistic libido, which thus takes place, obviously implies an abandonment of sexual aims, a desexualization, a kind of sublimation, therefore. Indeed, the question arises, and deserves careful consideration, whether this is not the universal road to sublimation, whether all sublimation does not take place through the mediation of the ego, which begins by changing sexual object libido into narcissistic libido, and then, perhaps, goes on to give it another aim. Superscript 1. We shall later on have to consider whether other instinctual vicissitudes may not also result from this transformation, whether, for instance, it may not bring about a diffusion of the various instincts that are fused together. Although it is a digression from our aim, we cannot avoid giving our attention for a moment longer to the ego's object identifications. If they obtain the upper hand and become too numerous, unduly powerful, and incompatible with one another, a pathological outcome will not be far off. It may come to a disruption of the ego in consequence of the different identifications becoming cut off from one another by resistances. Perhaps the secret of the cases of what is described as multiple personality is that the different identifications seize hold of consciousness in turn. Even when things do not go so far as this, there remains the question of conflicts between the various identifications into which the ego comes apart, conflicts which cannot, after all, be described as entirely pathological. Superscript 1. Now that we have distinguished between the ego and the ID, we must recognize the ID as the great reservoir of libido indicated in my paper on narcissism, 1914c. The libido, which flows into the ego owing to the identifications described above, brings about its secondary narcissism, point 5. But, whatever the character's later capacity for resisting the influences of abandoned object cathexes may turn out to be, the effects of the first identifications made in earliest childhood will be general and lasting. This leads us back to the origin of the ego ideal, for behind it there lies hidden an individual's first and most important identification, his identification with the father in his own personal prehistory. Superscript 1. This is apparently not in the first instance the consequence or outcome of an object cathexis. It is a direct and immediate identification and takes place earlier than any object cathexis. But the object choices belonging to the first sexual period and relating to the father and mother seem normally to find their outcome in an identification of this kind, and would thus reinforce the primary one. The whole subject, however, is so complicated that it will be necessary to go into it in greater detail. The intricacy of the problem is due to two factors: the triangular character of the Oedipus situation and the constitutional bisexuality of each individual. In its simplified form, the case of a male child may be described as follows. At a very early age, the little boy develops an object cathexis for his mother, which originally related to the mother's breast and is the prototype of an object choice on the Anaclitic model. The boy deals with his father by identifying himself with him. For a time, these two relationships proceed side by side, until the boy's sexual wishes in regard to his mother become more intense and his father is perceived as an obstacle to them. From this, the Oedipus complex originates. Point superscript 2. His identification with his father then takes on a hostile coloring and changes into a wish to get rid of his father in order to take his place with his mother. Henceforward, his relation to his father is ambivalent. It seems as if the ambivalence inherent in the identification from the beginning had become manifest. An ambivalent attitude to his father and an object relation of a solely affectionate kind to his mother make up the content of the simple positive Oedipus complex in a boy. Perhaps it would be safer to say with the parents, for before a child has arrived at definite knowledge of the difference between the sexes, the lack of a penis, it does not distinguish in value between its father and its mother. I recently came across the instance of a young married woman whose story showed that, after noticing the lack of a penis in herself, she had supposed it to be absent not in all women, but only in those whom she regarded as inferior, and had still supposed that her mother possessed one. In order to simplify my presentation, I shall discuss only identification with the father. Along with the demolition of the Oedipus complex, the boy's object cathexis of his mother must be given up. Its place may be filled by one of two things: either an identification with his mother or an intensification of his identification with his father. We are accustomed to regard the latter outcome as the more normal. It permits the affectionate relation to the mother to be, in a measure, retained. In this way, the dissolution of the Oedipus complex would consolidate the masculinity in a boy's character. In a precisely analogous way, the outcome of the Oedipus attitude in a little girl may be an intensification of her identification with her mother, or the setting up of such an identification for the first time, a result which will fix the child's feminine character. These identifications are not what we should have expected, since they do not introduce the abandoned object into the ego, but this alternative outcome may also occur, and is easier to observe in girls than in boys. Analysis very often shows that a little girl, after she has had to relinquish her father as a love object, will bring her masculinity into prominence and identify herself with her father, that is, with the object which has been lost, instead of with her mother. This will clearly depend on whether the masculinity in her disposition, whatever that may consist in, is strong enough. It would appear, therefore, that in both sexes the relative strength of the masculine and feminine sexual dispositions is what determines whether the outcome of the Oedipus situation shall be an identification with the father or with the mother. This is one of the ways in which bisexuality takes a hand in the subsequent vicissitudes of the Oedipus complex. The other way is even more important, for one gets an impression that the simple Oedipus complex is by no means its commonest form, but rather represents a simplification or schematization which, to be sure, is often enough justified for practical purposes. Closer study usually discloses the more complete Oedipus complex, which is twofold, positive and negative, and is due to the bisexuality originally present in children. That is to say, a boy has not merely an ambivalent attitude towards his father and an affectionate object choice towards his mother, but at the same time, he also behaves like a girl and displays an affectionate feminine attitude to his father and a corresponding jealousy and hostility towards his mother. It is this complicating element introduced by bisexuality that makes it so difficult to obtain a clear view of the facts in connection with the earliest object choices and identifications, and still more difficult to describe them intelligibly. It may even be that the ambivalence displayed in the relations to the parents should be attributed entirely to bisexuality, and that it is not, as I have represented above, developed out of identification in consequence of rivalry. In my opinion, it is advisable in general, and quite especially where neurotics are concerned, to assume the existence of the complete Oedipus complex. Analytic experience then shows that in a number of cases one or the other constituent disappears, except for barely distinguishable traces, so that the result is a series with the normal positive Oedipus complex at one end and the inverted negative one at the other, while its intermediate members exhibit the complete form with one or other of its two components preponderating. At the dissolution of the Oedipus complex, the four trends of which it consists will group themselves in such a way as to produce a father identification and a mother identification. The father identification will preserve the object relation to the mother which belonged to the positive complex, and will at the same time replace the object relation to the father which belonged to the inverted complex. And the same will be true, mutatis mutandis, of the mother identification. The relative intensity of the two identifications in any individual will reflect the preponderance in him of one or other of the two sexual dispositions. The broad general outcome of the sexual phase dominated by the Oedipus complex may, therefore, be taken to be the forming of a precipitate in the ego, consisting of these two identifications in some way united with each other. This modification of the ego retains its special position. It confronts the other contents of the ego as an ego ideal or superego. The superego is, however, not simply a residue of the earliest object choices of the ID. It also represents an energetic reaction formation against those choices. Its relation to the ego is not exhausted by the precept, "You ought to be like this, like your father." It also comprises the prohibition, "You may not be like this, like your father." That is, you may not do all that he does. Some things are his prerogative. This double aspect of the ego ideal derives from the fact that the ego ideal had the task of repressing the Oedipus complex. Indeed, it is to that revolutionary event that it owes its existence. Clearly, the repression of the Oedipus complex was no easy task. The child's parents, and especially his father, were perceived as the obstacle to a realization of his Oedipus wishes. So his infantile ego fortified itself for the carrying out of the repression by erecting this same obstacle within itself. It borrowed strength to do this, so to speak, from the father, and this loan was an extraordinarily momentous act. The superego retains the character of the father, while the more powerful the Oedipus complex was and the more rapidly it succumbed to repression, under the influence of authority, religious teaching, schooling, and reading, the stricter will be the domination of the superego over the ego later on, in the form of conscience or perhaps of an unconscious sense of guilt. I shall presently bring forward a suggestion about the source of its power to dominate in this way, the source, that is, of its compulsive character, which manifests itself in the form of a categorical imperative. If we consider once more the origin of the superego as we have described it, we shall recognize that it is the outcome of two highly important factors, one of a biological and the other of a historical nature, namely, the lengthy duration in man of his childhood helplessness and dependence, and the fact of his Oedipus complex, the repression of which we have shown to be connected with the interruption of libidinal development by the latency period, and so, with the diphasic onset of man's sexual life. According to one psychoanalytic hypothesis, the last-mentioned phenomenon, which seems to be peculiar to man, is a heritage of the cultural development necessitated by the glacial epoch. We see, then, that the differentiation of the superego from the ego is no matter of chance. It represents the most important characteristics of the development both of the individual and of the species. Indeed, by giving permanent expression to the influence of the parents, it perpetuates the existence of the factors to which it owes its origin. Psychoanalysis has been reproached time after time with ignoring the higher, moral, suprapersonal side of human nature. The reproach is doubly unjust, both historically and methodologically. For, in the first place, we have from the very beginning attributed the function of instigating repression to the moral and aesthetic trends in the ego, and secondly, there has been a general refusal to recognize that psychoanalytic research could not, like a philosophical system, produce a complete and ready-made theoretical structure, but had to find its way step by step along the path towards understanding the intricacies of the mind by making an analytic dissection of both normal and abnormal phenomena. So long as we had to concern ourselves with the study of what is repressed in mental life, there was no need for us to share in any agitated apprehensions as to the whereabouts of the higher side of man. But now that we have embarked upon the analysis of the ego, we can give an answer to all those whose moral sense has been shocked and who have complained that there must surely be a higher nature in man. Very true, we can say, and here we have that higher nature in this ego ideal or superego, the representative of our relation to our parents. When we were little children, we knew these higher natures. We admired them and feared them, and later we took them into ourselves. The ego ideal is therefore the heir of the Oedipus complex, and thus it is also the expression of the most powerful impulses and most important libidinal vicissitudes of the ID. By setting up this ego ideal, the ego has mastered the Oedipus complex and at the same time placed itself in subjection to the ID. Whereas the ego is essentially the representative of the external world, of reality, The superego stands in contrast to it as the representative of the internal world of the ID. Conflicts between the ego and the ideal will, as we are now prepared to find, ultimately reflect the contrast between what is real and what is psychical, between the external world and the internal world. Through the forming of the ideal, what biology and the vicissitudes of the human species have created in the ID and left behind in it is taken over by the ego and re-experienced in relation to itself as an individual. Owing to the way in which the ego ideal is formed, it has the most abundant links with the phylogenetic acquisition of each individual, his archaic heritage. What has belonged to the lowest part of the mental life of each of us is changed, through the formation of the ideal, into what is highest in the human mind by our scale of values. It would be vain, however, to attempt to localize the ego ideal, even in the sense in which we have localized the ego, or to work it into any of the analogies with the help of which we have tried to picture the relation between the ego and the ID. It is easy to show that the ego ideal answers to everything that is expected of the higher nature of man. As a substitute for a longing for the Father, it contains the germ from which all religions have evolved. The self-judgment which declares that the ego falls short of its ideal produces the religious sense of humility to which the believer appeals in his longing. As a child grows up, the role of father is carried on by teachers and others in authority. Their injunctions and prohibitions remain powerful in the ego ideal and continue, in the form of conscience, to exercise the moral censorship. The tension between the demands of conscience and the actual performances of the ego is experienced as a sense of guilt. Social feelings rest on identifications with other people on the basis of having the same ego ideal. Religion, morality, and a social sense, the chief elements in the higher side of man, were originally one and the same thing. According to the hypothesis which I put forward in Totem and Taboo, they were acquired phylogenetically out of the father complex, religion and moral restraint through the process of mastering the Oedipus complex itself, and social feeling through the necessity for overcoming the rivalry that then remained between the members of the younger generation. The male sex seems to have taken the lead in all these moral acquisitions, and they seem to have then been transmitted to women by cross-inheritance. Even today, the social feelings arise in the individual as a superstructure built upon impulses of jealous rivalry against his brothers and sisters. Since the hostility cannot be satisfied, an identification with the former rival develops. The study of mild cases of homosexuality confirms the suspicion that in this instance, too, the identification is a substitute for an affectionate object choice which has taken the place of the aggressive, hostile attitude. With the mention of phylogenesis, however, fresh problems arise, from which one is tempted to draw cautiously back. But there is no help for it. The attempt must be made, in spite of a fear that it will lay bare the inadequacy of our whole effort. The question is, which was it, the ego of primitive man or his ID, that acquired religion and morality in those early days out of the father complex? If it was his ego, why do we not speak simply of these things being inherited by the ego? If it was the ID, how does that agree with the character of the ID? Or are we wrong in carrying the differentiation between ego, superego, and ID back into such early times? Or should we not honestly confess that our whole conception of the processes in the ego is of no help in understanding phylogenesis and cannot be applied to it? Let us answer first what is easiest to answer. The differentiation between ego and ID must be attributed not only to primitive man, but even to much simpler organisms, for it is the inevitable expression of the influence of the external world. The superego, according to our hypothesis, actually originated from the experiences that led to totemism. The question whether it was the ego or the ID that experienced and acquired these things soon comes to nothing. Reflection at once shows us that no external vicissitudes can be experienced or undergone by the ID, except by way of the ego, which is the representative of the external world to the ID. Nevertheless, it is not possible to speak of direct inheritance in the ego. It is here that the gulf between an actual individual and the concept of a species becomes evident. Moreover, one must not take the difference between ego and ID in too hard and fast a sense, nor forget that the ego is a specially differentiated part of the ID. The experiences of the ego seem at first to be lost for inheritance, but When they have been repeated often enough and with sufficient strength in many individuals in successive generations, they transform themselves, so to say, into experiences of the ID, the impressions of which are preserved by heredity. Thus in the ID, which is capable of being inherited, are harbored residues of the existences of countless egos, and when the ego forms its superego out of the ID, it may perhaps only be reviving shapes of former egos and be bringing them to resurrection. The way in which the superego came into being explains how it is that the early conflicts of the ego with the object cathexes of the ID can be continued in conflicts with their heir, the superego. If the ego has not succeeded in properly mastering the Oedipus complex, the energic cathexis of the latter, springing from the ID, will come into operation once more in the reaction formation of the ego ideal. The abundant communication between the ideal and these UCS instinctual impulses solves the puzzle of how it is that the ideal itself can to a great extent remain unconscious and inaccessible to the ego. The struggle which once raged in the deepest strata of the mind and was not brought to an end by rapid sublimation and identification is now continued in a higher region, like the Battle of the Huns in Kaulbach's painting.